Today is October 27, 2017, and we're here to discuss the principles of truth again. So let us seek for understanding and guidance from our Heavenly Family. Heavenly Family, thank you so much for loving us and for being so willing to lead us and take us on step by step, showing us the truth and then correcting our errors and helping us to see our own condition. We can really see that we need your help a lot. Please guide us in tonight's discussion to understand reality more and to be able to have our way of thinking changed to be in accordance with truth. Thank you for this. We ask for this B'Shem Tzemach, in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so as you guys know, there have been several meetings lately, including weekend meetings, in which Teresa and I have not been able to participate, but we're here again, and I know some of the things that you guys have been discussing, and I know that you guys continued on talking a bit about logical fallacies and cognitive biases and different things like that, which is all very good, and we may end up going through more logical fallacies tonight. But what I wanted to do first is just to see if anyone has questions on anything related to the message, especially things that we have been discussing lately, whether in regard to logic and reasoning, or, we had Davidian History Day recently, and then we also had a new moon topic dealing with pre-Israelite literature and things like that. And I just wanted to see if anyone had questions on any of those topics or their implications. So the floor is open if anyone has any questions. Okay, well, not hearing any questions. So in that case, we will continue on talking about some of these logical fallacies. Some of the most recent ones that we discussed were the bandwagon fallacy, which is the belief that an argument is valid because a majority of people accept it. And then we talked about special pleading, which is where a proponent of a position attempts to cite something as an exemption to a generally accepted rule or principle without justifying the exemption. And then we also talked about the straw man fallacy, which is misrepresenting an opponent's stance in order to refute that false argument and create the illusion that one has defeated the opponent. So, of course, we've talked about many fallacies before these ones, but those are some of the most recent ones that we have looked at, and I just wanted to remind you guys of them and to draw all of our thinking into logic mode and logical fallacy mode. So the first one that we are going to discuss is called slippery slope. And we've touched on it a little bit. It's something that we have discussed somewhat on the calls. But slippery slope, the slippery slope fallacy itself, is asserting that a relatively small first step inevitably leads to a chain of related events culminating in some significant impact or event that should not happen. Thus, the first step should not happen. So it's saying, well, if you do this, then that'll happen. And then if you do that, that'll happen. And then that'll happen. And that'll happen. And you go down this chain of events to some undesirable end result and say, therefore, you shouldn't make the first move. So I'll give an example that's from a website, logicallyfallacious.com. And this is example number 1. We cannot unlock our child from the closet because if we do, she will want to roam the house. If we let her roam the house, she will want to roam the neighborhood. If she roams the neighborhood, she will get picked up by a stranger in a van who will sell her in a sex slavery ring in some other country. Therefore, we should keep her locked up in the closet. So you can see how illogical that is, and actually on the Logically Fallacious website, they actually list the probability of each one of these instances. In other words, if you had a child locked in the closet and let them roam their room, it is fairly likely that they will want to roam the house. So that's okay. But then if they roam the house, it's not like just automatic that they'll want to roam the neighborhood. It's, it's possible, but not that likely. And if they roam the neighborhood, getting picked up by a stranger in a van is actually a lot less likely, and then getting sold into sex slavery in another country is far less likely, and it ends up being like a probability of 1 in 25 million or something like that. And so, what they point out on the website is that morally and legally, of course, it's wrong to lock a child in a closet anyway, but logically it's also wrong because, really, are you going to make a decision based off of a 1 in 25 million probability? So it doesn't really follow. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that's the slippery slope fallacy. Someone choosing to do something based on what they perceive to be a chain of events that might result from that with an undesirable conclusion. Therefore, you better not start the chain. When really, the chain is not inevitable. It wouldn't just happen like that in all probability anyway. I'll give a few other examples of the slippery slope fallacy, which you will all find easy to accept and follow. So someone might say to an individual considering accepting the three angels' messages and joining the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they might say, well, if you accept Ellen White, then you'll end up becoming a Davidian, accepting Victor Houteff, and then Ben, and then Lois, and then you'll end up following David Koresh. Well, that's like a slippery slope fallacy where you're saying the end result, an undesirable conclusion, means that you shouldn't start anywhere. Or someone might even say, oh, you shouldn't be religious at all because then you're going to end up, following someone like David Koresh. Okay, so that's, again, slippery slope fallacy. Another one. If you accept that Moses did not write the Pentateuch, you will reject what the Pentateuch says. And if you reject what the Pentateuch says, you will reject what all the rest of the books of the Bible say. And if you do that, you will lose faith in God and be lost forever. Okay. Again, slippery slope fallacy. It's not necessarily the case that if you reject the idea that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, that you will reject what the first 5 books of the Bible say. That's not a necessity. And likewise, even if you reject what the first 5 books of the Bible say, it doesn't mean that you're going to reject what the rest of the books of the Bible say. And even if someone rejects everything the Bible says, it doesn't mean that they're going to stop believing in God. So like this whole chain of events does not actually naturally follow from one aspect to another. And people often will say, well, this will lead to that and that and that and that, and it's undesirable, therefore you should, avoid making this first step to begin with. And it's kind of really ultimately, in some of these instances at least, it's a fear tactic to say, oh, look, no, you're going to be eternally lost. You're going to go down this path and then this path and this path and this path and be lost because of what position you may hold on this one issue, which ultimately is unrelated to the end conclusion. Another very similar example is if you reject the inspiration of any of the 66 books of the Protestant canon, you will reject others and then all, and then Jesus, and be lost forever. Again, slippery slope fallacy. Now, here's another one, which is more common to hear people say this sort of thing. If we allow women's ordination, well then we're going to have to allow, all of these immoral dress codes or lack of dress codes, and allow all sorts of impropriety, and then we're going to have to allow homosexuality, and if we allow homosexuality, then we're going to have to allow, any type of sexual relationship. Okay, so that's going down a slippery slope and trying to say, oh, you shouldn't ordain women because it's going to lead to all of these other things, when it doesn't necessarily lead to any of those things. Another instance of slippery slope. And this next one is one that I found also on a website listing logical fallacies. If we allow gay marriage, the next thing we know, people will want to marry their dogs or their cats. Or what about their pigs? So you go to an undesirable conclusion and say, well, this first thing leads to that, when it doesn't necessarily lead to that. Those are quite different issues. So even if one opposes the legalization of gay marriage, that would be a fallacious argument to give, to say that, well, if you legalize gay marriage, then you're going to have to legalize, bestiality and so on and so forth. And then another one that I found, this is also on the logicallyfallacious.com website. And this one is a little bit crude, so I just wanted to give that warning, but not so different from the previous one, and no more crude than anything, than some of the things that you read in the Bible. So I would hope that no one would be offended, but it's an interesting example nonetheless. So this is the fallacy, according to this website. If you accept that the story of Adam and Eve was figurative, then you will do the same for most of the Old Testament stories of similar literary styles. Once you are there, the New Testament and the story of Jesus does not make sense, which will lead you to believe that the resurrection of Jesus was a spiritual one. Once you accept that, you won't be a Christian anymore. You will be a dirty atheist. Then you will have no morals and start having sex with animals of a barnyard nature. So you better take the story of Adam and Eve literally before the phrase, "that chicken looks delicious," takes on a whole new meaning. So that's, again, the example given, or the second example given on the logicallyfallacious.com website. And you can see how ridiculous it is to go on this whole chain of events in which each step does not necessarily lead to the other, and say, oh, you have to have this certain interpretation of the Bible, or you are going to be an atheist and going to be immoral and start, committing acts of bestiality. I mean, those things do not follow from each other. But it's actually quite common for people to give reasons like this for holding particular positions, especially when it comes to religious ideas. Very often people identify being a Christian with being a good person. And there's really no reason to identify those two together. I mean, there's people who are quote-unquote good people of all various religions and non-religions, and there are people who are not quote-unquote good people who are Christians. So the two are not, immediately related and automatically associated with one another. But that perception sets it up for slippery slopes within Christianity a lot, because people will think, oh, well, if you don't hold to what I think would be a true Christian by having a certain set of beliefs, well, then you're going to end up going down this path, and you're going to be a bad person. Because remember, most Christians don't view all Christians as true Christians. Catholics don't view Protestants as true Christians. Protestants don't view Catholics as good Christians. Baptists don't view non-Baptists as good Christians. And I'm making general statements. It's not that every Baptist or every Catholic or every Protestant thinks these things about the other, but it's very, very common. A lot of Adventists don't view non-Adventist Christians as good Christians. And so they might say, well, if you drop the Sabbath and go to another church, well, then you're not a true Christian, and then you won't be a good person, and that is going to lead you to do all these wicked things, and so on and so forth, when that is not necessarily the case. I'm not, of course, arguing that it's a good idea or a safe idea or anything like that for someone to abandon the Sabbath and join another church. But I am saying that for someone to argue that someone should not do that on the basis that it's going to lead to some undesirable conclusion is a fallacious form of argument. So, does anyone have any comments or questions on the slippery slope fallacy?
I do. It's kind of interesting, especially the slippery slope, and I've actually heard people do the same thing with bandwagon, where they'll actually use it as their argument, actually the term. Like, Mary was one time presenting sinlessness to a person, and the person said, oh, that is a dangerous slippery slope. So they're actually taking the term. And I understand the fallacy, people believe these things are true, but they're actually using the name of the fallacy to promote their point. I've heard people even say, in whatever their position was, that I'm on the bandwagon, but especially in slippery slope. So it's just interesting that a lot of people will use the name of the fallacy like in a powerful way for their fallacy point.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out, and I have heard it with both examples that you gave for sure. But yeah, I agree, especially with the slippery slope. People will even label it. Pretty ironic and unfortunate. Any other comments or questions on this fallacy? All right, we'll go on to the next one then. This next fallacy is called appeal to tradition, a conclusion supported solely because it has been long held to be true. So that's the appeal to tradition. So I'll give you first a couple examples that I found online. These are also both from the logicallyfallacious.com website, which, by the way, a lot of the really good examples that I've found online for various fallacies have been from that website. So if you guys are interested in checking this all out more, logicallyfallacious.com seems to be a pretty good resource. So the first example that they give is a conversation between two people, Dave and Caitlin. So Dave says, For 5 generations, the men in our family went to Stanford and became doctors, while the women got married and raised children. Therefore, it is my duty to become a doctor. Caitlin says, do you want to become a doctor? Dave says, it doesn't matter. It is our family tradition. Who am I to break it? Okay, so it's making a claim in terms of what should be done, and the only basis of the claim is tradition. So that's a logical fallacy, and this is the sort of thing that is so common for people to make life decisions based on family or cultural traditions, when that's not really a good means of evaluating what one should do in a given circumstance. So that's a pretty straightforward, dry example. Example 2, marriage has traditionally been between a man and a woman. Therefore, gay marriage should not be allowed. Okay, so again, I must stress, regardless of what one thinks about gay marriage, arguing that it should not be allowed on the basis of tradition is logically fallacious. That is not a good argument. And examples like this I find very helpful and useful because we hear people saying things like this a lot in social discourse. When we're giving examples like example 1, sure, it gives you the idea of the fallacy, but when we don't have something which applies to present circumstances, it's harder to really grasp the importance of it and to apply it in circumstances in which we should apply it. So, anyway, those are the 2 examples from logicallyfallacious.com. Another example is the idea that Chinese medicine is legitimate because it has been practiced for so long. I mean, that's given a lot. You know, when people, if someone is promoting certain forms of Oriental medicinal practices, and someone else comes along and says, oh, I don't really believe in that. Often what someone will say is, well, people have been doing this for thousands of years, you know, as though that means that it's legitimate. But just because something has been done for a long time doesn't mean that it is legitimate. Bloodletting has been done for, or I guess I should say has been done for a long time, because I'm sure some people still do it. But the vast majority of people anyway, even in alternative health circles, recognize that bloodletting is not a good practice. And the fact that it's been done for so long isn't viewed for that issue to be a good reason to still do it. So it's really just not a good reason. Something being done for a long time or being traditional has no bearing on the idea that it is true or valid. Other traditions that people accept because they've been held to be that for a long time. The idea that Matthew wrote Matthew, Mark wrote Mark, Luke wrote Luke, John wrote John. Well, with actually I was going to say something incorrect, but caught myself. I was going to say with John it's a little different, but I was thinking of the book of Revelation, because in Revelation it claims to be written by John, but the Gospel of John does not claim to be written by anyone named John. So the 4 Gospels in the New Testament are anonymous, but it has been long held that they were written by these 4 individuals named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And, you know, a lot of people argue that, well, it's the tradition. It goes back so far. I mean, it must be true. People argue the same thing when it comes to the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch. And you'll hear people saying things like, well, we couldn't all be wrong. Well, that's kind of the bandwagon fallacy. But if you extend it back in time, are you saying that all of these people, like my parents and my grandparents and my grandparents' grandparents, going back all these hundreds of years, have been wrong? You know, that's going along with the appeal to tradition. You know, this has been thought to be true for a long time, therefore it must be true. Obviously, that is fallacious. Does anyone have any comments or questions on appeal to tradition, or want to give any other examples?
I kind of think in a weird way, kind of like the American dream also, because of tradition, we think that's really a terrible thing to give up, for this message. I guess it's not, it is kind of a tradition, but it's sort of like just a mindset, too, that because this is the way America is, or capitalism is the way we've been brought up, we have this tradition in our heads even that, I don't think we label it tradition, but we just think this is right, because it has been the tradition in America, instead of, logically, breaking with that tradition as being the best way to live.
Yeah, I would agree.
Well, I was having the thought that maybe somewhere along the line, somebody, an Adventist or Davidian even, maybe even Branch, who knows, might say something like, well, but all of the previous prophets believed that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. And so hearing the appeal to tradition, it might be, commonplace for someone who believes in modern prophets to think, but that doesn't apply to a prophet's beliefs. And so it's not appealing to tradition, maybe it's even an appeal to authority. Or,
I was going to say it's a mix of both,
mm-hmm.
because they're thinking they're appealing to authority, but thinking that that's a good thing, when in reality, they're appealing to tradition.
Right.
Yeah.
And still, I can see the genuine confusion if a person doesn't understand the nature of inspiration.
Of course.
Exactly how it operates, and what we're supposed to take as inspired from the writings of an inspired messenger. And maybe you can clarify what I mean by that.
Repeat your last sentence again.
About claiming that there's, portions of a prophet's writings that are inspired.
You're talking about Ellen White's condemnation of people doing that, or what?
No. To be honest, I kind of lost the point, the way I was coming at it. But, so maybe I'll try again. So if a person truly believes that, hey, it's a prophet. If they said it, they believed it, surely it must be true. So it's a genuine thing, and it's a sincere confusion if they don't understand the nature of inspiration, and that being, recognizing that there are portions of a prophet's writings, and I think what I had said is that are inspired, and I was wanting you to clarify what I mean by that.
Okay. Well,
because I think you can find a better words.
Okay, so Victor Houteff, he said a very similar statement to what you just said, and he said we take that part of Ellen White's writings, which originated with her, to be inspired.
Right.
Which implies that there's some other part that didn't originate with her, which is kind of weird, but since she wrote it all down, of course. But Victor Houteff really spelled that out clearly elsewhere, where he expressed that prophets do hold in common with other people in their day views and perspectives which are not unique to their message. And they may, in conveying their message, make incidental reference to those common ideas and beliefs, even expressing it themselves as their own belief, in order to bring out the points of their message. And if those commonly held beliefs turn out to be wrong, the prophet should not be held accountable, nor should God be held accountable. So that's the idea. It's really separating the unique and original ideas, the aspects of things which stand out as distinct from other people in their day. You know, those elements are the message. That's the unique part. That's where inspiration is at work. But it doesn't mean that the prophet is right on everything. It doesn't mean that they're infallible. And they will very well hold ideas which are common to their day. You know, and I'll just give an example in this message. Several years ago, I would have said, if someone asked me, there are 9 planets in this solar system. Whereas today, I would say there are 8 planets in the solar system. And I would even qualify it to say, so far as we know. But that's because today, the consensus is that there are 8 planets in the solar system. But what if a 9th planet and then a 10th planet are discovered? Well, would that mean that this message is wrong because I repeated the common view that I hold in common with other people, that there are 8 planets? No, that's the best available information at the time. I hold that view in common with other people. I recognize that more discoveries may be made, and it may turn out that there are more planets than that. But that's not a unique claim. That's not a special point of the message. It's just, you know, I have this understanding in common with everyone else in, you know, at this time. And so, you know, really, the message does not in any way hinge upon that being true or false. So that's just an example that could be given. Did that explain kind of the principles you were hoping to have?
Exactly. Yes, totally. So anyway, that brings me back around to my initial comment of how a person might think, well, hey, these other prophets believed that Moses wrote the Pentateuch.
Mm-hmm.
And so, you know, obviously there's ways to go about explaining that, but I don't know if you have anything you want to say about that or not.
Well, there's something else that I want to say that's kind of another example of appeal to tradition that dovetails the example that you gave. Because, you know, the example you gave is, well, the prophets believed this, and it ended up being that their belief of that was actually just a traditional belief, not a unique statement or point. But that was, the example that you gave was dealing with modern prophets. Well, let's push this back further. What about ancient prophets? Would this be an appeal to tradition? If someone was to say, for example, when Jesus died on the cross, he said concerning the Roman soldiers, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And someone says, well, how do you know that Jesus really said that? And they reply, well, the Bible says so.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think? Is that appeal to tradition?
I think it is. Sort of projected authority on what the Bible says is all being true and tradition.
Exactly, yeah. So that's definitely that same sort of thing, and I'm glad that you pointed out that it's also throwing in appeal to authority. But what people who advocate, quote-unquote, the Bible often miss is that the very idea of the Bible and the particular collection that constitutes the Bible whether for Protestants, Catholics, Greek Orthodox, Ethiopian Orthodox, whatever, that is a tradition. So saying this is true because the Bible says so, or we know this to be true because the Bible says so. Arguing the Bible says so as a reason for something being true is actually appeal to tradition. I know that's so different from what we're used to thinking, because so often we are used to contrasting the Bible with tradition. Oh, well, this is the Bible, and you just believe that because of the traditions of men. But really, the whole idea of a collection of writings, and a particular collection of writings, let's say the 66-book Protestant canon, is really a tradition. And that's actually another example. The canon itself is a tradition saying, well, these 66 books are the Bible. And, we know this because, well, as Protestants, we've always held this to be the case. Well, that's appeal to tradition. But even arguing a specific point to be true because the Bible says so is appeal to tradition. Any other comments or questions on this before we move on to the next one?
There's an argument you can't disprove it either, isn't there?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
The argument is there that you cannot disprove it either. Is that correct? Is that correct thinking, that possibly it can't be proved or disproved? Can it be disproved that Christ said that?
Okay, so someone may say that, but that would be an instance, for example, of a logical fallacy, which is shifting the burden of proof. Because the point is, whoever makes the claim has the burden of proof. So if someone comes and says, Jesus said that, Father, forgive them for they know not what they do, the person who says that Jesus said that is the one who has the burden to provide the evidence that he actually said it. If someone denies that he said it, in the sense that they say, well, I don't know if he said that, I don't believe that he said that, they don't have to provide evidence that he didn't say that. It's the person who is saying, this is what Jesus said, that has the burden to provide the evidence.
Now, if someone were to say, Jesus did not say that, then they would have to prove that he did not say that. And that's where you come in, Gary, with the idea that, well, you can't really prove that he did not say that, but just the fact of not being able to prove that he did not say that does not prove that he did say that.
That would be a false dilemma fallacy. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Excellent.
That's a good question.
Yeah, definitely. Does anyone else have comments or questions before we move on?
For burden of proof, if I make a claim that Jesus' new name is the branch, then it's a positive way to do the burden of proof, right? Because I am making a claim and then I need to show them the verses, the new name of Jesus. So that's my question.
Okay, so I'll repeat the question as far as I understand it. So basically, like if you say to someone that Jesus' new name is branch, then are you the person who has the burden of proof in order to show that that's the case? And then you can bring forward the various scriptures and so on that talk about Jesus' new name as branch. So basically, yeah, if you make a claim such as Jesus' new name is branch, then you do have the burden to prove that. So if someone else came along and they said, well, I don't believe that, they don't have to prove that it's wrong. we are the ones who have to prove that it is true. Now, of course, like Teresa was pointing out in the last example, if someone was to then come along and they made a claim and they said, Jesus' new name is not Branch, or if they said Jesus does not have a new name, or anything like that, if they were to make a claim like that, then they would have to prove that claim, but that doesn't change. Exactly. That doesn't change that we would still have to prove our claim. It's not like it's only the case that one person has a burden of proof. It's everyone who makes a claim has a burden of proof. Even if it's, let's say you have two people in a conversation, if both of them are claiming something, they have to prove their own claim. So that's basically how it works. Does that answer your question, or was there another element that I didn't address?
Yeah, that was really clear. Just for some reason, I was thinking about logical fallacy, meaning like the thinking is not right. So like burden of proof, that would be a negative thought or idea. So then I was thinking, if I am always make claim, then it's going to be the burden of proof. That sounds negative, but actually what you are saying, just teaching us that whoever make a claim, the person's supposed to make a explanation. That doesn't mean it's a negative. So the burden of proof is not like negative thing at all. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Basically, you're saying it's not a negative thing to have the burden of proof, and I agree. It really isn't a negative thing to have the burden of proof. The only reason why someone might not want to have the burden of proof is if they don't really have evidence. There's a lot of, like in this message, there are a lot of claims that we make, and I'm happy to have the burden of proof for those claims because we have evidence to show that those claims are true. And so I have no reason to not want the burden of proof. I'm fine with having the burden of proof. And if there's something that I don't have evidence for, then I just don't make a claim for that thing, and then I don't have a burden of proof. And that's fine. Like, that's okay. If we don't make a claim on something, then we shouldn't have the burden of proof. But yeah, this whole issue with the burden of proof is really important to understand, and I'm glad to hear you understanding it, and I hope that everyone else on the calls and in the message in general is really understanding the principles involved with the burden of proof. And we should definitely not try and shift the burden of proof on others when it is our own, and we should gladly take on the burden of proof when we do make claims.
It's interesting in Rachel's example, a person who makes a claim and then doesn't have any evidence to back it up, actually is committing a logical fallacy. Their claim could be correct, but the logical, they have no evidence, so they're basing their opinion on some form of a logical fallacy like tradition or the bandwagon or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. Or even as simple as proof by assertion. This is true because, So, yeah, exactly. If you don't have, like, I'll put it like this. Everyone wants to have a reason for their belief. And asking someone why they believe something, I've never heard them say, for no reason. Like literally no reason. Usually there's some sort of reason, whether it's faith or I was raised that way or whatever. Like there's always some sort of reason. But you're right that if it's not evidence, it's always going to be some form of logical fallacy. All right. Well, I think it's been really good to discuss this appeal to tradition fallacy quite a bit and kind of going on to some of the principles related to it. are there any other comments or questions on it, or are you guys ready to go on to the next one? I'll take that as you guys are ready to go on to the next one. And we'll just go through this one more. So this will be the last one for tonight. And this fallacy is called Association Fallacy. And it takes two forms. There's guilt by association, and there's also honor by association. But both of them are manifestations of the association fallacy. And it's arguing that because two things share or are implied to share some property, they are the same, at least in some respects. So here's an example that I found online. Simon, Carl, Jared, and Brett are all friends of Josh, and they are all petty criminals. Jill is a friend of Josh, therefore Jill is a petty criminal. So it's kind of saying, oh, well, all the friends of this person are petty criminals, therefore, oh, you're a friend of that person? Well, you must be a petty criminal too. That's guilt by association, which is a manifestation of the association fallacy. So here's another one. David Koresh was called the leader of the Branch Davidians. You guys are Branch Davidians. Therefore, you're followers of David Koresh. You guys are a cult. You're corrupt, so on and so forth. Well, that's simply association fallacy. That's not any sort of valid argument or reasoning at all. Another one, if an Adventist gives someone a Bible study, and in the Bible study, the identity of Michael comes up, Michael the Archangel, and Adventists say, oh, well, that's Jesus. It's common for some to say, oh, you guys are basically like the Jehovah's Witnesses then. And they're a cult, therefore you guys are a cult too. Okay, so because there is some aspect of similarity, one is just grouped in with the other, and it's viewed as being pretty much the same, or the same in some respect. Mormons and SDAs are pretty much the same because they both have modern prophets. That doesn't really mean anything. It's like, okay, so some things have, some aspect of similarity, therefore they're the same. No, it doesn't quite work like that. Another example, someone might say that Branch Davidians are infidels because they are materialists. Well, just because there are infidel materialists and there are Branch Davidian materialists does not mean that Branch Davidians are infidels no more than it means that infidels are Branch Davidians. So, again, doesn't really work. Now, those are all kind of guilt by association fallacies. Here are a couple honor by association fallacies, which is still association fallacy. So one might say, Martin Luther King was a Baptist. Martin Luther King was a good person. Therefore, Baptists are good. So Baptists all get a good name because of Martin Luther King. That doesn't make sense, right? It's just association fallacy. Just because Martin Luther may have been a good person, Martin Luther King, doesn't mean that all Baptists are good people. Another association fallacy that's honor by association is people will say, well, Ellen White taught Seventh-day Adventist doctrine. And then they'll say, Ellen White did good things. She established all these medical institutes and health reform, and she had all this good advice and established schools, etc., etc. Therefore, she was a true prophet. Her teachings were true. No, Ellen White, having done good things and being a good person, does not mean that Adventist doctrine is true. or that Adventists are the right people or anything like that. Now, as you guys know, that type of reasoning is offered a lot in Revelation seminars. And a lot of people come into the Seventh-day Adventist Church, being won over by some arguments like that. And maybe some of you here were even won over by arguments like that. Not that I expect that, or I'm saying that that is the case. But even if that is the case, you may have even joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church based on a logical fallacy. Like, that's very possible. But again, let's always avoid fallacy, saying that because an argument for a conclusion is fallacious, therefore the conclusion is false. No, that would be a fallacy in its own right. Someone may very well form a belief based on false reasons and the belief be true. To say otherwise would be committing the fallacy. So here's another one. Galileo was persecuted for his beliefs. Galileo was right. I'm persecuted for my beliefs. I'm right. That's one that I found online. And yeah, I mean, that sort of thing happens a lot, where people will say, well, Jesus was persecuted and the apostles were persecuted, and now you guys are persecuting me, or you're persecuting us. And since Jesus was true, well, therefore we must be true. Well, that doesn't really make sense. I mean, a lot of people are persecuted for a lot of different beliefs. But just being persecuted for belief doesn't mean that you are correct. Doesn't mean that the belief is true. And of course, in this instance, the example that was given isn't just the idea of being persecuted, but it's because other people were persecuted. And therefore, if a good person was persecuted and we share being persecuted with that person, it would be fallacious to say that for that reason our belief is correct. Now here's another one that's guilty by association. People will say, well, Stalin was an atheist, and Stalin had millions of people killed. Therefore, atheism is evil. And then people will say, well, Hitler was an atheist, and Hitler killed lots of people. Therefore, atheism is evil. And often people, by the way, will do this. With atheism, they'll do a slippery slope to things like Hitler and Stalin. Oh, well, this is what atheism leads to. Hitler, Stalin, etc. And that doesn't really make sense. And then, of course, you might say, well, atheists are bad, or atheism is bad because Stalin was bad and he was an atheist. Or Hitler was bad and he was an atheist. And by the way, I'm not convinced that it's true that Hitler was an atheist. He certainly has statements which seem to indicate otherwise, but that's a side issue. But anyway, that sort of argument is given a lot, and it doesn't make sense. And I think Richard Dawkins, who's probably the most famous atheist alive today, he pointed out that, Hitler and Stalin both wore a mustache. So obviously it must be mustaches that are really evil. It's like, just because there's some commonality or because they happened to be, have some particular trait, doesn't mean that that's what caused it. So Stalin being an atheist isn't what led him to kill all these people, no more than him having a mustache is what led him to kill all these people. So anyway, people end up arguing, using really bad arguments, really fallacious arguments against opposing positions simply because they are opposing positions, and people tend to accept arguments against opposing positions as valid simply because they are against opposing positions, and people tend to accept arguments in favor of positions which they accept as valid simply because they are in favor of positions which they accept. So we need to be careful to never do that. So anyway, does anyone have comments or questions on the association fallacy?
I was going to mention the guilty by association. I'm sure, some of us who were Shepherd's Rod Davidians have experienced some sort of that. I just remember a couple incidences where when Michael got disfellowshipped, they wouldn't baptize his brother because he was Michael's brother, and therefore he might believe in the Shepherd's Rod, which he didn't, but nonetheless they wouldn't baptize him, right? So that's guilty by association.
Yeah, that's a quite vivid example of that, a sad one at that.
And sorry, I remember another one where after Michael got disfellowshipped, it's always Michael being disfellowshipped, the church found some Shepherd's Rod tracts slipped in between some books in the church library. And therefore, because, Michael was a Shepherd's Rod believer, it was him that slipped them in between the books. So that was another experience that he had.
Yeah, that's definitely another example of that. So the reasoning is, Michael is a Davidian, and there's Davidian literature in this book, therefore it was him. So guilty by association. Does anyone else have comments or questions on this fallacy?
Oh, yeah. So for the association fallacy, I was thinking about the claim that Ellen G. White said if a person can come over with appetite, that person most likely can overcome a lot of weakness. So something like that. Was that a fallacy?
That's a good question. So Ellen White made the statement that if you can overcome temptations in regard to appetite, then you can overcome any other sin. So is that a association fallacy? Is that an example of that? And it really isn't an association fallacy, because she wasn't just simplistically saying that, well, if you can overcome this one temptation, then you can overcome all temptations, simply because they share the trait of being temptations. No, it's because there's actually a connection between the two, where the principles involved in overcoming the temptation of appetite are the same principles involved in overcoming any temptation. So, in other words, they are actually the same thing in principle, and therefore, if you can do one, you can do the other. So there are things that are genuinely the same in principle. And so I'll give you an example. If you can drive one vehicle, let's say, or one automatic car, then you should be able to drive all automatic cars. Why? Because the principles involved in driving one are the same as in driving another. If you've learned to drive one, it is really not different from driving another. Now, if you were to say, well, you can drive a car, therefore you can fly an airplane. I mean, they both have engines. that would be association fallacy, because you're just using the fact that they both have engines, which is an unrelated commonality when it comes to the issue at hand, to say that you can do both, when really that aspect of sameness has no relationship to the ability of the person to do it. But if the aspect of sameness is actually the important aspect when it comes to the question at hand, then it's not fallacious. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah. Can I give one more example? The one who is faithful. The one who is faithful in a very little is also faithful in much, and the one who is dishonest in a very little is also dishonest in much. Luke 16:10. So, in this passage, it's talking about aspect, faithful and dishonest. So that is not association fallacy, because it's an aspect, it's a concept. Is that right?
Well, first I have to qualify this, because the words that are used, like the actual verse that you read there, the words could be used in a way that would be fallacious, but they can also be used in a way that isn't fallacious. So, for example, it is possible for someone to, let's say, lie about, I don't know, how many toothbrushes they have, something that seems rather insignificant. They could lie about that and then be honest on some really important issue. Or they could be honest about that, like, oh yeah, I have 2 toothbrushes. And then they might lie on some really big issue, like they might lie to their spouse about something, or they might lie on their tax forms, something like that. So people can either be honest or dishonest on something that seems like a small issue, and then when it comes to really big issues, they could do the reverse. So if one understands those words as saying that that's not the case, then it would be fallacious. And it would be, an association fallacy if someone was to say, well, this person is honest with this little thing, therefore they must be honest in some big thing, because it shares the commonality of honesty. So that would be fallacious. However, I don't think that that's the point of the verse. I don't think that's the point that Jesus was getting across, if indeed Jesus said that. And, I'll put it like this. I said a very similar thing on a recent call. And the way that I explained it is that all the big things are actually made up of the little things. In other words, there's really no difference between the big things and the little things, because everything that we do in a moment, and that moment is always now. Every decision we make is just our present little decision, and put together that ends up being big things. But everything that's a big thing, you can kind of break down into smaller little bits. And so if you say that if you are faithful in the little things, you are faithful in the big things, and what you mean by that is that the little things put together are the big things, and so being faithful in the little actually does make you faithful in the big, and if you're unfaithful in the little, you are unfaithful in the big, because the big is just the accumulation of the little, then it's not actually a fallacy. It's not association fallacy, because it's simply saying that one is the other. It's just whether you break it up into little bits or view the accumulation of those bits as a whole. So I hope that answers your question.
Oh, yes, that was really clear. But now my next question would be, how do we evaluate a person in general? How do we evaluate things?
Okay, so
yeah.
I just want to clarify. So your question is how, like in general, how do we evaluate claims?
Yes, right, because that more fallacy I learned, then I probably would suddenly, into a lot of thing doesn't have critical thinking.
Okay, so in regard to like how we should evaluate claims, really our sole question should be, is there evidence in favor of the claim? That should really be the sole question, because if we're evaluating a claim and we're looking for logical fallacies to test the claim, it's not going to work, because someone could give bad reasons. They could offer fallacious reasoning for their claim, and their claim still be true, and they just happen to give bad reasoning. So really the only question at hand when evaluating a claim is there evidence in its favor? And if there is evidence in its favor, and it's actually real evidence, then the claim is true. If there is not evidence in its favor, then we cannot be justified in thinking that the claim is true. Therefore, we should not believe the claim. Now, that doesn't mean that we should then say that the claim is false. In order to say that the claim is false, we have to actually have evidence that the claim is false. So the best way is, someone makes a claim, we try and find out if there's evidence for it. If there's evidence for it, then we accept the claim. If we don't find valid evidence for it, then we simply don't accept the claim, which means that we basically just say, I don't have evidence for it, therefore I'm not going to say it's true. But since I don't have evidence that it's false, I'm also not going to say that it's false. I just remain unconvinced until there is sufficient evidence in its favor. That is, of course, unless we come across evidence against the idea, then we can actually say that the claim is false. So does that answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you for reminding again. Thank you.
No, that's good. That's such an important question. I'm really glad that you asked, because when we got into this study of logical fallacies, we did so by first talking about knowing how to arrive at truth, how to tell the difference between what is a valid belief and what is not a valid belief. And we got into logical fallacies to say, hey, look, if all we have for something is logical fallacies, we don't have a good reason to believe it. And if someone promotes something and all they're giving is logical fallacies, they are not giving you a good reason to believe it. Even if there is a good reason, if all they're giving you is logical fallacies, they aren't giving you a good reason. So we need to be careful not to believe things based on logical fallacies, and that will definitely help us to arrive at truth if we avoid logical fallacies. And I think this is helpful as well. I know we talked about the nature of evidence a bit when we talked about we had a couple studies, science-based medicine, and then we went into science-based everything. And that's really discussing the importance of valid evidence. So anyway, we have been on the call now for an hour and 20 minutes, so it'll be good for us to wrap it up. Does anyone have any final comments or questions?
I have one. It's back on one of Rachel's first comments / questions about Ellen White's statement in regard to overcoming appetite. And if we do that, then we'll have, I believe it's phrased, we'll have the moral power to overcome every other temptation of Satan. I, in the past, have always understood that to mean that if we're eating healthy, then we'll be able to think clearly enough and be strong enough to overcome every other temptation of Satan. Now, while I do acknowledge that there is some correlation there, because if we are doing things to our bodies that disable our mental capacity, then
it would be harder.
It would be harder for sure. It affects our mental clarity and our decision-making process to whatever degree. But I am recognizing that it really doesn't make sense for her to mean what I thought she meant and what everyone that I know who promotes the health message in Adventism claims that she means. It absolutely makes far more sense that, hey, if you overcome this, then obviously it shows that you're operating by right principles. And if you can do it there, you can do it everywhere. So I really benefited from that tonight, among many other things, but I didn't understand that rightly.
That's awesome. And I want to give a couple other reasons why that common interpretation of Ellen White's statement cannot be correct. So the idea that's kind of implicit in that is, well, if you can't overcome appetite, then you're going to be clouded, and in that clouded, unhealthy state, you'll, of course, give in to other sins, which isn't necessarily the case. Someone can be unhealthy and can have an imperfectly functioning brain and still have victory over temptation. Because Jesus did not have a perfectly functioning brain and not have a perfectly healthy body, and he overcame every temptation. He had a body that was affected by sin, just like the rest of us. And then on the flip side, Genesis, of course, speaks of Adam and Eve as perfect beings with perfect appetites, and then they gave into temptation, and obviously
Lucifer himself.
Yeah, and Lucifer himself. There you go. So you have people who had been, well, I'll put it like this. If the first human sin was giving in to false appetite, well, then the sin occurred in the thought prior to actually eating the food. And so it shows that even having a perfect body or a perfectly functioning brain and all of that cannot keep someone from giving in to temptation. So, yeah, I'm glad that you highlighted this aspect, Teresa. Any other last comments or questions?
Well, Sister White also talks about dyspepsia, right? How people with dyspepsia, is this related, will tend to have a sour demeanor or kind of like grumpy and, just always not feeling well. of course, right, with the dyspepsia. Would that have any relation to the topic of overcoming, the temptation of appetite?
Well, it depends exactly on what you mean by that. It relates to the discussion for sure, but the whole thing, like if someone has an upset stomach, that's going to give them extra challenges, and they will have the tendency or the inclination to be grumpy and upset and all of that. But they are not required to. Even with the illness, they are not required to have that temperament. And so, really it's not like that's like the thing to hinder. I mean, what Jesus experienced in terms of even physical pain on the cross was far worse than dyspepsia. And yet he didn't give in to temptation. So having those conditions, again, Ellen White, she talked about health reform and all of that, in order to kind of say, hey, don't make it harder on yourself by putting yourself in a bad physical condition. But she wasn't saying that you can't overcome temptation while having those conditions, nor was she saying that not having those conditions means that you won't give in to temptation. It's just that if we violate the laws of health and bring bad health upon ourselves, we will just make it harder on ourselves.
Right. Thank you.
No problem. Anything else from anyone, or are you guys ready to bring it to an end? Would anyone like to thank our Heavenly Family?
I will. Heavenly Family, thank you again for a wonderful meeting and for educating us. We appreciate growing in knowledge and understanding, and I hope that it'll change each and every one of us so that we can make an impact on the world for the better and bring an end to sin. Thank you so much. We thank you in the name of Branch. Amen.
Amen. All right, love you all. Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.